They found her curled beside the dying coals, a ghost made of ice and desperation. Her arms were wrapped tight around herself, a futile shield against the biting wind. The hem of her thin skirt was frozen solid to the earth, trapping her like a fly in amber. Her lips were cracked and blue, her boots were gone, and the shawl draped over her shoulders was so flimsy it looked like it would shatter if you touched it. Two little girls, twins no older than 8, stared down at her. Their eyes were wide, dark, and full of a curiosity that only children possess in the face of death. "Is she dead?" one of them whispered, her breath making a tiny cloud in the frigid air. The other girl didn't answer. Instead, she reached out a small, mittened hand and gently, so gently, touched the woman's cheek. She pulled her hand back fast. "No," she said, her voice full of surprise. "She's breathing." Their father appeared from the pines, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. He was tall, his frame lean and powerful, with long black hair tied at the nape of his neck. He didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. He took one look at the woman, then stepped forward and lifted her from the snow. He held her as if she weighed nothing at all, her limbs stiff and fragile as a dead bird's. The twins followed close behind as he carried her through the snow-dusted trees, their footsteps the only sound in the vast, cold quiet. They were heading toward a modest lodge, tucked so perfectly between 2 sandstone ridges you'd miss it if you weren't looking. He laid her down near the hearth, wrapping her in a heavy buffalo hide before turning and walking right back out into the cold, leaving the girls to watch over the stranger. They knelt beside her, 2 small sentinels, waiting. Hours passed. The fire crackled, spitting embers that danced in the dim light. Outside, the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. And then, the woman stirred. Her eyes blinked open, hazed over with a thick fog of confusion. "Where?" she rasped, her voice like sandpaper. The older twin was ready with a carved wooden cup. She held it to the woman's lips, offering a sip of water. "You were asleep in the snow," the girl said, her tone simple and matter-of-fact. "Papa brought you here." "Papa doesn't talk," the younger one added, as if sharing a great secret. "But he saw you. He knew." The woman tried to sit up, to get her bearings, but a gasp of pure agony tore from her throat. She looked down at her feet. They were raw, blistered, the flesh swollen and discolored from the frost. The sight was horrifying, the pain even worse. I had nowhere else to go," she whispered. The words meant more for herself than for the children. They were a confession, the end of a story she thought had already concluded in the snow. But the older girl just nodded as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "Then you came to the right place," she said. "We lost Mama 2 winters ago. Papa hasn't smiled since." The woman's eyes, already blurry with pain, welled up with tears. A deep, aching sorrow for these 2 little girls and their silent father bloomed in her chest. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "Me too," the younger girl replied. And then she did something completely unexpected. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled something out, placing it gently in the woman's lap. It was a spoon. A worn, smooth wooden spoon, its handle carved with intricate floral patterns, faded and softened by time and countless hands. It was an object of simple beauty, but it felt as heavy as a stone. "That was our mother's," the younger twin said, her voice soft but sure. "Papa carved it for her. We want you to have it." The woman stared at it, speechless. It felt like a sacred thing, too precious for her to even touch. Her hands were dirty. Her past was dirty. She was nothing. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice cracking. The older twin looked her straight in the eye. Her gaze was unnervingly direct, ancient. "Because today," she said, "we decided you can marry our papa. We already talked about it. The woman's breath hitched. Her mind, already reeling from the cold and the pain, couldn't process the words. "But I don't even know him," she stammered, her eyes wide with shock. The girls didn't flinch. They looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. "You will," the younger one said with absolute certainty. "He's kind, and you look like you need someone kind." Just then, the heavy hide flap of the lodge was pushed aside. The giant frame of the Apache man filled the doorway, blocking the last of the evening light. He had returned. This time, he was holding a small pot of stew, the steam rising from it in fragrant clouds, and another blanket, this one warmed by the fire he must have been tending outside. He still said nothing. Not a single word. He set the food beside her, then gently, carefully, wrapped the second blanket around her trembling shoulders. He looked into her eyes for the first time, and she saw it. Not pity, not duty, just presence. A deep, anchoring presence that didn't demand anything, didn't ask questions, didn't need to explain itself. The woman, who hadn't said her own name in months, who hadn't heard it spoken by anyone who didn't mean her harm, suddenly felt it rise to her lips. "I'm Eliza," she whispered. One of the girls beamed, a brilliant, gap-toothed smile. "I'm Na," she said, pointing to herself, "and she's Tali." The man, their father, gave the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his attention back to the stew, stirring it with a stick. Eliza looked from his broad, silent back to the girls' hopeful faces, then down to the spoon still resting in her lap. She had been owned, bought, sold, and discarded. She had been ignored by men who should have protected her and hunted by men who saw her as nothing more than an object. And now, in the middle of nowhere, at the end of everything, she had been offered a family by two brave little girls and a silent man who carved spoons and made soup. She hadn't agreed to stay. She hadn't agreed to anything. But as her fingers closed around the smooth, carved wood of the spoon, she had the strangest feeling that the choice had already been made. Eliza awoke to the smell of boiling herbs and the soft, rhythmic scrape of metal on wood. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Not the cold, hard floor of a barn, not the icy dirt behind some forgotten saloon. She was here, inside a warm lodge, wrapped in heavy furs, the coals of the fire still glowing nearby. Her feet throbbed with a dull, persistent ache as she shifted under the weight of the buffalo hide. When she pushed herself up slightly, wincing at the movement, she saw him. The Apache man. He was seated just outside the lodge's open flap, his back partially to her. He was carving a strip of wood with long, practiced strokes of a small, sharp knife. His arms were bare despite the morning chill, the muscles in his shoulders and back coiling and uncoiling with a quiet, efficient strength that didn't need to boast. Beside him, one of the twins, Tali, she thought it was, sat with her knees tucked to her chest, watching his hands with rapt attention. Eliza saw the girl say something, her small voice lost to the crisp air. The man paused his carving. He didn't look at the girl, but he gave a slow shake of his head. Then he did something that made Eliza's heart clench. He reversed the knife and offered it, handle first, to the child. Tali took it as if it were the most sacred object in the world, her small fingers wrapping carefully around the well-worn hilt. Eliza blinked, a heavy, unfamiliar emotion settling in her chest. She had known so many men in her short, hard life. Shouting men, grabbing men, laughing men who always wanted something from her. Something she was never willing to give. But this man, he hadn't spoken a single word to her. He hadn't asked her for anything. And yet, he had given her warmth. He had given her safety. He had given her stew. His silence spoke louder than any words ever had. Later that morning, the other twin, Na, entered the lodge carrying a steaming bowl. "Papa said you need to eat more," she announced cheerfully. Eliza blinked in confusion. I thought you said he doesn't speak. Na giggled, a sound like tiny bells. Not with words, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The stew was hot and rich, thick with chunks of rabbit and wild roots that tasted of the earth. Eliza ate slowly, not out of politeness, but out of a sense of disbelief. It was the first real meal she'd had in weeks. When she finished, scraping the last drop from the bowl, Na handed her a folded cloth. Inside was a fresh pair of thick wool socks. They were clean and soft and impossibly warm. He made these too, Na said proudly. He carves in the morning. He sews at night. What else does he do? Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tali, who had appeared silently behind her sister, answered. He listens, she said, and he remembers. That afternoon, Eliza decided she had to try to stand. The pain when she put weight on her frostbitten feet was sharp, blinding. It shot up her legs and made her vision swim. She bit her lip hard, tasting blood, determined not to cry out, but her legs buckled. She was going to fall. And then, just before she hit the hard-packed earth floor, a strong arm was there, steadying her. The man had appeared without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He didn't lift her this time. He didn't carry her like a fragile burden. Instead, he offered her his arm, as if she were his equal. She leaned on him, her body trembling with pain and weakness. Together, slowly, they moved toward the lodge's entrance and stepped outside. The snow had begun to melt in soft, wet patches, revealing the dark earth and scattered cedar needles beneath. The weak winter sun was caught in the man's long black hair, making it shine like a raven's wing. For a moment, it seemed as if the wilderness itself bowed to his presence. They didn't speak. She didn't ask his name. He didn't ask for hers again. They just stood there, breathing in the cold, clean air. When she shivered, not from cold, but from the sheer intensity of the moment, he draped the shawl he had been wearing over her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and him. When she finally turned to go back inside, exhausted by the effort, he stayed right beside her, a silent pillar of support, until she was settled safely back under the furs. That night, long after the lodge had grown dark and the girls had curled up together near the fire, Eliza lay awake. She couldn't sleep. She stared at the spoon they had given her, which she kept beside her sleeping pallet. In the flickering light of the dying embers, she traced the carvings on the handle. Flowers, notched leaves, and something else. Tiny initials carved into the base. A and K. A man who carved spoons, a man who sewed socks, a man who lifted her without question, yet never made her feel owned. A man who hadn't asked her to stay, but was making it utterly impossible to leave. She pressed the cool wood of the spoon to her chest, right over her heart. And for the first time in so many years, Eliza cried. But they weren't tears of fear or shame or pain. These tears came from a place of deep, profound silence, a silence she hadn't known how to break until a silent man and his 2 little girls had shown her how. By morning, the snow outside had crusted over to a hard, glittering silver, and the air inside the lodge was warm with the scent of sleeping bodies and wood smoke. Eliza hadn't slept much, but her body felt different. It had accepted the rest, the warmth, the safety, like parched earth finally taking in a long-awaited rain. She sat up slowly, taking care not to wake the twins, who were still curled up like 2 perfect kittens near the glowing embers of the fire. The carved spoon was still clutched in her hand. She turned it over again in the faint morning light, her thumb tracing the 2 letters at its base. AK. She had no idea what they meant. Maybe they were his initials, or maybe they were the initials of someone he had lost. The thought sent a pang through her chest. She had the strangest feeling that this spoon, this family, hadn't been meant for her. But somehow, they had found her anyway. She hobbled to the entrance of the lodge, leaning heavily on the doorframe for support, and peered outside. The man, Papa as the girls called him, was there. He was chopping firewood beside the lodge, his movements fluid and economical and sure. The axe rose and fell in a perfect, powerful rhythm. He didn't look up when she stepped into the weak morning light, but she knew. Somehow, he knew she was there. He slowed the axe, splitting one last log with a clean crack. He placed it neatly onto the growing pile, then wiped his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. "I need to say thank you," Eliza said. Her voice sounded small and thin in the vast, quiet morning. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his expression as unreadable as the stone ridges behind him. But then he did something strange. He stepped forward, not to touch her, not to speak, but to gently, carefully take the wooden spoon from her hand. He held it for a moment, his large, calloused fingers dwarfing the delicate carving. Then, with one finger, he pointed directly at the initials. "Atacoma," he said. His voice was low and quiet, like the sound of distant thunder. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak, and the sound of it vibrated through her, settling deep in her bones. Is that your name?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. He nodded once, a single decisive movement. Then, after a long pause, he pointed at her. "Eliza," he said. He didn't ask. He stated it. It was her name, spoken by him, and it felt real, solid. She whispered her own name back to him just to feel it in her mouth. "Eliza." "Ada," she tried, shortening his name, testing it. He didn't smile, not with his mouth, but she saw a faint softening around his eyes, a tiny shift in the lines of his face that told her she had gotten it right. Just then, the twins came bursting out of the lodge, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. They had a handful of bright red snowberries. Tally, the bolder one, ran up and shoved a few into Eliza's hand. "He likes you," she declared with a wide grin. "Tally," Atacoma warned, his voice still quiet but carrying a new, gentle authority. He spoke in the Apache tongue, a language Eliza didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. "What? It's true," Tally insisted, switching back to English and grinning up at Eliza. "Papa carved you a spoon. He only does that for family." Eliza blinked, the berries forgotten in her palm. I'm not family." "You are now," Na said simply, as if stating a fact of nature, like the sun rising or the snow falling. She dragged a small wooden stool from inside the lodge and placed it right beside Eliza, patting it expectantly. That day passed in a way Eliza had never experienced before. It was a day without fear, a day without looking over her shoulder. She tried to help with the chores, fetching water and stirring the ever-present stew, though Ada never let her carry anything heavy. She learned the rhythm of their lives, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by the ringing of a work bell or the angry shout of a man. Morning chores, midday stew, evening quiet. Ada spoke very little, but he showed her everything. He showed her how to read the tracks of rabbits and deer in the snow. He showed her how to twist dried grass into tight bundles for kindling. He showed her how to listen to the sound of the wind in the pines, to understand its messages about the weather to come. When she clumsily burned her hand on the hot stew pot, he didn't scold her. He gently guided her hand into a bowl of clean, cold snow he had brought inside, then wrapped the burn in a piece of soft, supple hide. When she winced at her own foolishness, he just shook his head once and murmured, his voice low and rumbling, "Still learning means still strong." That night, as the girls sat by the fire, braiding long strands of grass into little dolls, Eliza sat with them. Ada sat across from them, near the entrance of the lodge, carving another spoon. This one was smaller, simpler, the kind a child might use. "Why spoons?" Eliza asked quietly, her gaze on his moving hands. It was Tali who answered before Ada could. Because spoons feed, she said, parroting words she had clearly heard many times before. He says it means you believe they'll stay. Eliza looked down at the original spoon, the one from their mother, which she now kept tucked in the sash of her dress. Her heart gave a hard, painful thud. No one had ever believed she would stay anywhere, not even herself. She had always been temporary, disposable. But here, under a roof of rough-hewn pine-wood beams, under the watchful gaze of a silent man, she felt something new beginning to bloom in the cracked and barren landscape of her heart. She looked up, her eyes meeting Ada's across the flickering flames. I think, she said, her voice clear and steady, I want to earn this spoon. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. This time he smiled. A real, slow smile that transformed his entire face, erasing the harsh lines of grief and solitude and replacing them with a warmth that was more powerful than the fire itself. And in that moment, Eliza knew she was in more danger than she had ever been in the snow. This wasn't the danger of dying. This was the danger of living. By the fourth day, a strange new rhythm had settled into Eliza's bones. She stopped waiting for the sound of angry footsteps behind her. She stopped expecting the gnawing chill of loneliness to creep back in when the fire died down. The lodge, though small and simple, had begun to feel like a fortress. It wrapped her in warmth each morning, a physical sensation that felt like her own body, remembering how to breathe without fear. Ada had a routine. He rose before dawn, his footsteps a whisper on the packed snow. He would disappear into the pre-dawn gloom and always return with something. A brace of rabbits, an armload of firewood, a handful of berries frozen firm and sweet on the branch. He would leave these offerings near the doorway without a word, but the placement, the care, it told her more than any sentence could. One morning, she found a new shawl, this one lined with soft rabbit fur, folded neatly beside the stew pot. The next, a pair of new moccasins, stitched with incredible skill, sat perfectly beside her old, torn boots. The girls never explained the gifts. They just smiled their knowing smiles and wrapped her in their stories as they brushed her hair with their small, gentle fingers that smelled of smoke and pine. That evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, rattling the hide flap at the door, Ada did something different. He finished his meal, stood up, and gestured for her to follow him, not with a command, but with a simple, questioning tilt of his head. He was going outside, into the teeth of the wind. She hesitated. The warmth of the fire was a powerful anchor, but his expression was gentle, not demanding. He extended a hand, palm up. He wasn't giving her an order. He was offering her a choice. She took it. His hand was rough and calloused, but it closed around hers with a surprising warmth. They walked quietly through the trees, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The snow crunched loudly beneath their feet. The world was dark and wild around them. After a few minutes, she saw a shape loom out of the darkness. It was a low shelter, almost a hut, built of stacked stone and stretched hides. Smoke curled from a small hole in the roof. Her heart began to beat faster. Inside, a small fire was already glowing low in a stone hearth. He had built this. He had built this for her. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a test. It was something else entirely. Something sacred. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside. Her fingers brushed against the smooth, cold stone of the walls. A neatly woven blanket was laid out on a simple cot built of logs and hide. For me? She asked, the words feeling inadequate. Ada nodded, his dark eyes watching her reaction intently. If you stay, he said. The words were plain, unadorned, but they pressed into her like a physical weight, a warmth spreading from the inside out. She turned to face him, unsure what to say, what to do. and she saw he was holding something out to her, another spoon. This one was different from the first. It was carved from a deep red cedar, polished to a perfect soft sheen. The bowl of the spoon was curved like a flower petal, and there, etched into the base of the handle, was her name, Eliza. She took it with trembling hands. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the letters, her own name carved with such care. "You carved my name," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded again, just a single, steady nod. "Then I'll stay," she whispered back, and this time her voice didn't shake at all. It was the truest thing she had ever said. That night she sat by the fire in her own small stone shelter. She was wrapped in the fur-lined shawl he had given her, the new spoon clutched in her hand, watching the snow fall through the smoke hole in the roof. It drifted down in silent, lazy flakes, illuminated by the firelight. She heard the soft crunch of footsteps outside. Ada stepped in, ducking his head to get through the low entrance. He set a clay bowl of stew at her feet, then sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. His presence beside her said everything she needed to hear. He would not ask for more than she was ready to give. He would not touch her unless she offered her hand first. He was a man who understood boundaries because his own had been so violently crossed. She looked over at him, her eyes searching the shadows that the firelight cast on his strong, silent face. "Why me?" she finally asked, the question that had been burning in her mind for days. He stared into the flames for a long, long moment before answering. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble. "Because the fire waited for you." She didn't know what that meant, not exactly, but her heart did. It gave a powerful thud, once, twice, and then seemed to quietly, perfectly, settle into rhythm with his. The girls would probably find them in the morning, curled near the embers, not touching, but together. Her head might be on his shoulder, the spoon still clutched in her palm, sharing the warmth of a fire that he had built, a fire that had never once gone out. But then he shifted. He turned to her in the dim light, and his eyes were full of a terrible, ancient sadness. "That is not the whole truth," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I needed you." Eliza frowned. "Needed me? For what? To cook? To clean?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I saw the tracks around you in the snow, not animal tracks, boot prints. A single set of prints. A man's. He left you there." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She had been so out of her mind with cold and exhaustion, she hadn't even considered it. She had just assumed she had collapsed alone. "He led you out there," Ada continued, his voice hardening, "and he walked away. I followed his tracks back, almost to the town. He didn't even look back once." The stew sat forgotten at her feet. The warmth of the shelter suddenly felt like a lie. The cold was inside her now, a familiar creeping dread. "Who was he, Eliza?" Ada asked, and his voice was no longer gentle. It was the voice of a hunter. She couldn't speak. The name was a poison on her tongue. "I need to know his name," Ada pressed, his gaze boring into her. "Because a man who leaves a woman to die in the snow is not a man. He is a monster, and monsters need to be hunted." Eliza looked at the strong, capable man beside her, at the firelight glinting off the knife at his belt, and she realized he hadn't just saved her from the cold. He had saved her for a reason. He wasn't just offering her shelter. He was offering her vengeance. And that was a temptation more dangerous than any other. The first time he said her name, it wasn't loud. In fact, she wasn't even sure it was meant for her ears. She was standing in the doorway of her stone shelter just after dawn, watching the world awaken. Atta stood with his back to her, near the edge of the trees, whispering something into the snow-drifted branches. At first, she thought it was a prayer, a quiet communion with the morning. But then she heard it, soft as pine needles falling onto fresh snow. Eliza. Her name, spoken in the Apache tongue. It sounded different, not harsh or demanding, but like a reverent offering to the spirits of the forest. She hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since anyone had spoken her name with gentleness. Not since before the wedding. Not since before her entire world had gone cold and hard. She stepped out into the crisp morning light, the cedar spoon still tucked into the sash at her waist like a talisman. "I heard you," she said, her voice clear. He turned. He wasn't startled. He wasn't embarrassed. He was just quiet, present. "I speak it to the wind," he said, his gaze steady, "so the wind learns to carry it gently." An unexpected laugh bubbled up out of her. The sound of it was so foreign, so out of place in the grim landscape of her life, that it startled a nearby jay into a flurry of blue feathers and angry squawks. It had been months, maybe years, since laughter hadn't felt like a betrayal of her own grief. That morning, they walked together, leaving the relative safety of the lodge clearing behind. They went beyond the trees, to a place where the land dipped down toward a stream. It was still frozen in places, but under the growing warmth of the longer days, it was cracking slowly open, the sound of running water a promise of the coming spring. The twins followed, skipping and dancing between the stark white trunks of the birch trees. They collected dry branches for a fire, singing a song together in their own language. Eliza didn't know the words, but the melody was sweet and sad and hopeful all at once, and she could feel it down to her ribs. They made a small fire on the muddy bank of the stream. Ada took out the obsidian blade he wore on a leather cord around his neck and showed her how to slice a fish clean, how to remove the bones with a few deft movements. His hands moved with a rhythm that was never rushed, that never sought to impress. It was the rhythm of a man who simply wanted to share his knowledge. When Eliza reached for the knife herself, her hand hesitant, he didn't hover over her. He didn't correct her grip. He just handed it to her and said, his voice a low rumble, "Don't be afraid to ruin the first one." She did ruin the first one, and the second. Her cuts were jagged and clumsy, but she laughed again, a real full-throated laugh this time, and by the third fish her cuts were cleaner, her movements steadier. The weak sun was warm on her back, and when she looked up from her work, she saw the twins playing in the mud by the water's edge. They were making little figures out of stone and clay, naming each one after the people they hoped would come to their spring festival. One of the figures was taller than the others. It had a long braid made of woven grass, and clutched in its tiny mud hand was a miniature spoon carved from a sliver of bark. "That one's you," Tali said, pointing with a muddy finger and smiling her wide, gap-toothed smile. "You're the one who made Papa smile again." Eliza blinked hard, a sudden tightness in her throat. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to say it wasn't her, that she was just a refugee, a piece of driftwood washed up on their shore. She had only come to this place because she had nowhere left to go. But then Atta looked over at her, his expression as soft as melting snow, and she understood. Sometimes what you stumble into by accident is the very thing that has been calling to you all along. That night, back in the main lodge, Ada carved another spoon. It wasn't for her this time. It was different. The wood a pale, smooth birch. When he was finished, he handed it to her, not the spoon itself, but the knife he had used to carve it. "For someone else one day," he said, his gaze meaningful. "When you're ready to give what was given to you." She took the knife, its weight feeling heavy and significant in her palm. She traced the smooth wood grain of the new spoon with her thumb and thought of the women she used to know. Hard women, broken women. Women who were angry and quiet and 100 times braver than anyone ever gave them credit for. "Maybe," she said, her voice soft. "Maybe I'll carve dozens." He smiled that slow, rare smile of his. "Good," he said. Teach the wind new names. Later, back in the solitude of her stone shelter, she placed both of her spoons, the one from his wife and the new one he'd made for her, near the fire. She whispered the name she hadn't dared to say aloud in months, her own name. Eliza. And in the warm, safe silence of the lodge, for the first time since her world had fallen apart, it didn't sound like a name from a grave. It sounded like a promise, but the promise was tainted by the question he had asked. Who was he, Eliza? She knew she couldn't keep the truth from him forever. The man who had left her to die was not some stranger. He was not some passing cruelty. He was the man she had married, a man named Silas, a man with a smiling face and a heart of pure poison, and he wouldn't just let her disappear. Sooner or later he would come looking. She looked at the knife Ada had given her. It wasn't just for carving spoons. She knew that now. It was for protection, and she had a terrible, sinking feeling she was going to need it. The man, Silas, wasn't just cruel. He was clever. He wouldn't have just led her into the wilderness to die of exposure. That was too simple, too subject to chance. No, he had been leading her somewhere specific. There was something out here in this desolate landscape that he wanted, something he thought she could lead him to, and now she had inadvertently led Atta and his children right into the middle of it. The shelter Atta had built for her wasn't just a home, it was a target. That night, as the wind quieted and the stars thickened to a brilliant cold dust above the pines, Eliza sat by the fire in the main lodge. She held a bowl of rabbit stew in her lap, her fingers slowly, gratefully, warming around the heated clay. The twins had finally fallen asleep, curled against each other like two perfect mirror images, their tiny stockinged feet sticking out from beneath a heavy fur throw. Across from her, Ada was sharpening his obsidian blade, the motions slow, deliberate, and thoughtful. The only sounds in the lodge were the soft, rhythmic rasp of stone on steel and the occasional pop and hiss from the hearth. She hadn't realized until now how silence could feel like a conversation, how a space devoid of words could be so full of meaning. She watched him for a long time, the firelight playing over the strong lines of his face. Why me? She asked again, but this time the question was different. It wasn't about his kindness. It was about his suspicion, his need to know. He didn't look up from his work. He didn't stop the steady rhythm of his hands. Because they left you in the snow, he said, his voice a low rumble. And snow doesn't bury people like you, Eliza. It tests them. If they're still breathing when the morning comes, it means they're meant to change something. She blinked, unsure how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken of her survival as a sign of worth. It had always felt like a failure, a curse. She should have died with the others. I'm not strong, she said softly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I just didn't die. He finally stopped his work and looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. That's where strength begins, he said. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. And you didn't leave when you could have. You came back inside. You accepted the stew. That matters more. His words struck something deep inside her, a tiny buried core of defiance she thought had been extinguished long ago. A sliver of belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant only for grief and pain. Slowly, she set her bowl down and moved closer to the fire, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I used to think I had to earn everything, she said, her voice catching. Even love. That if I didn't work hard enough or stay quiet enough or serve well enough, I'd be discarded. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of her past. But here it's different. Ada nodded slowly. Because love isn't earned, he said. It's offered. And strength isn't given. It's revealed. The firelight flickered across his face, and she realized he wasn't speaking of romance. He meant something wider, deeper. a bond forged not by possession, but by mutual recognition. Two wounded people seeing the scars on each other and choosing not to turn away. Eliza reached into the small pouch she now wore at her waist and pulled out the little bark spoon the girls had carved in her image. "They said I made you smile again," she said, holding it up. "Is that true?" His answer was a silence so complete and profound it wrapped around her like a second skin. Then, slowly, he reached across the fire and took her hand, not with hunger or urgency, but with a reverence that stole her breath. He lifted her hand, her calloused, cracked, scarred hand, and gently he kissed the tips of her fingers. "You reminded me I have a face," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. She didn't understand at first. Then she saw their reflection in the burnished side of the stew pot beside them. His smile. It was small, rare, and heartbreakingly real. It wasn't the kind of smile a man wore for strangers or for survival. It was the kind of smile a man forgot he even had, until someone else came along and gave it back to him. Eliza looked at their hands, joined in the space between them, and felt the years of ice and snow inside her finally, truly, begin to melt. It wasn't passion that rose in her then, but presence, the solid, unshakable sense that she was no longer invisible, not to these children, not to this man. And for the first time in her life, she believed that being seen didn't have to mean being used. It could mean being chosen. As she felt herself drifting toward sleep beside the warmth of the fire, she whispered, "I'll stay, if you still want me." And in the darkness, a deep voice murmured back, "I've been waiting." But as her eyes closed, a terrifying thought surfaced. He had been waiting. But for what? For her? Or for the man who was hunting her? The man whose tracks he had followed back to the town? She had brought this danger to his doorstep. She looked at the sleeping girls, so peaceful, so innocent. Her presence here wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. The thought jolted her wide awake. Ada was looking at her, his smile gone, his expression once again hard and unreadable. "You need to tell me his name, Eliza," he said again, his voice flat and cold. "The girls' lives depend on it now, and so does yours." The warmth of the moment was gone, replaced by a chilling, terrifying reality. She had found a home, only to realize she was about to become the reason it was destroyed. By morning, the cabin smelled of wild sage and rabbit bones, simmered down to a rich, fragrant broth that Ada insisted would strengthen the blood. Eliza awoke from a restless sleep, the weight of his final words from the night before pressing down on her. She was beneath the same fur throw the twins had shared, now tucked gently around her own shoulders. When she sat up, the first thing she saw was the girls, sitting cross-legged by the fire, their heads bent together over a new carving. One of them, Na, looked up and grinned, holding out their creation. "It's a spoon," she said proudly. "For him." "Because you gave him back his smile," Tali added, her eyes shining. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat, sudden and sharp. The carving was clumsy, the lines uneven, but it was so full of tender childish love it made her heart ache. It was a child's understanding of love, turned into wood. Just then, Ada entered quietly from outside, a dusting of fresh snow on his boots and shoulders, his arms full of chopped logs. He set them down beside the hearth with a soft thud, gave her a single, sharp nod, and then sat near the flames to warm his hands. His eyes, usually so unreadable, lingered on the clumsy spoon in Na's hand, then flicked to Eliza. "They carved it before dawn," he said, his voice low and devoid of the warmth from the previous night. It was back to being flat, guarded. "They said it would balance the one they gave you, one for giving, one for receiving." Eliza couldn't speak, afraid her voice would crack and betray the terror that was coiling in her stomach. She simply watched as Na got up and presented the spoon to her father. He took it, his large hand gentle with the small, fragile object. When was the last time you were given something just because you were loved? Ada asked, his question directed at her, though he didn't look at her. He was studying the spoon. The question felt like a knife slipping cleanly through cloth, sudden and sharp, exposing everything raw and painful beneath. Never, she admitted, her voice a hoarse whisper. I've been paid for. I've been taken. I've been used, but not given to. Not like this. The silence stretched again, long and soft, like the snow that was beginning to fall outside once more. Finally, Ada looked up from the spoon and met her eyes. His gaze was piercing. Then take it, he said. Let it change what comes next. He wasn't talking about the spoon anymore. He was talking about the truth, the name. The girls had resumed their playing, now giggling quietly and elbowing each other as they worked on a new set of grass dolls. The peaceful, domestic scene felt like a cruel joke. Eliza knew she couldn't wait any longer. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady, and crossed the room to where Ada sat. She knelt beside him on the hard-packed earth. His name is Silas, she said, the name tasting like poison. Silas Croft. He was my husband. Ada's face remained a stone mask, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition? No, something else. Something colder. The man from the Sullivan claim, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she whispered. He didn't just abandon me, he was leading me somewhere. There's an old Spanish silver mine in these hills. My grandfather told me stories about it. Silas believes the stories are true. He thinks I know where it is. Atta was silent for a long moment, his knuckles white as he gripped the little spoon the girls had made. There is no silver, he said, his voice flat. The stories are a lie, a trap to keep greedy men away from the sacred lands. He looked at her then, his eyes burning with a cold fire. But he doesn't know that. He will come back for you. He thinks you are his map. I want to stay, she said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. Not because I owe you, not because I'm afraid, but because I've finally found a place where no one asks me to disappear. He looked at her, truly looked at her then, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the guarded weight in his shoulders loosen. The hardness in his jaw softened. He gave a single slow nod, but it carried the solemn weight of an oath. Then, as if afraid to shatter the fragile moment, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently to hers. No kiss, no claim. Just breath and closeness. A silent joining. The fire crackled, sending a shower of tiny sparks into the air like miniature dying stars. Eliza closed her eyes and let the heat of his skin settle into hers. It wasn't the heat of passion. It was the heat of a shared purpose, a shared danger. Tonight, Ada said, his voice a low whisper against her skin, we'll carve one together, a real one, for the table. She managed a weak smile. A table with 4 spoons. No, one of the twins piped up from across the room, her voice bright and innocent. 5. When you have a baby, they'll need one too. Eliza let out a shaky laugh, a sound that startled even herself. She didn't correct the girl. She didn't say she couldn't or wouldn't, or that they might all be dead by sunrise. For once, in this strange, terrifying, beautiful place, she let hope be more powerful than fear. And when she looked at Ada again, she saw that same desperate hope reflected back at her. Not the quiet kind that begged to be held, but the fierce kind. The kind that built cabins and fought off wolves. The kind that carved spoons and sharpened knives and healed hearts without ever asking for repayment. It was the kind of hope that could carry them forward. Step by step, meal by meal, fire by fire, together. It was just past noon when the first sound came. It was distant, but unmistakable, the muffled thud of horses' hooves on snow-packed ground. Eliza froze, the ladle dripping stew back into the pot. The girls, their senses as sharp as any wild creature's, darted to the window, peeking past the stitched hide flap. Ada was already moving. He didn't rush. He didn't make a sound. But in the space of a single heartbeat, he had his bow in his hand, an arrow knocked on the string. He moved with a silent, deadly precision that made the hair on Eliza's arms stand on end. The girls turned from the window to look at him. There was no fear in their eyes, only a grim, quiet expectation. "They're here," Tali whispered. "The men from the town." Eliza's pulse hammered against her ribs. She set the ladle down, her hands trembling so badly she had to clench them into fists. How can you be sure?" "Because one of them is the one who bought you," Ada said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He stepped into the doorway, planting himself there like a mountain that refused to be moved by any storm. The name he spoke wasn't Silas. It was Sullivan, the man who owned the claim Silas worked for, a bigger, more dangerous predator. Eliza swallowed hard, the bile rising in her throat. The memory of that man's eyes, cold, greedy, utterly without care, was burned into her mind. The girls came to stand beside her now, one on each side, each of them taking one of her hands in their small, warm ones. "You don't have to go back," Na said, her voice fierce. "He can't make you." Eliza tried to smile to reassure them, but the weight in her chest was so heavy it made the expression brittle and false. "Legally, I belong to no one," she said, her voice much quieter than she intended. "But that's never stopped men like him before." Ada didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on the tree line. "Then we stop him." The riders came into view. 3 of them. One was a large man with a thick gray beard and a red scarf tied around his neck, Sullivan. The other 2 were younger, leaner, their faces hard and cruel, rifles held casually across their saddles. They dismounted slowly, their sharp eyes scanning the snow-packed clearing, taking in the small lodge, the curl of smoke from the chimney, the pile of chopped wood. Then one of them pointed directly at the doorway. "There she is," he called out, his voice rough. "We'll be taking her back now, Apache. Don't cause no trouble." Ada didn't move from the doorway. He didn't raise his voice. "She stays," he said, the 2 words carrying more weight than 1,000 shouts. The bearded man, Sullivan, let out a harsh chuckle that scraped the air. "Don't matter what you say, Injun. She's property of the Sullivan claim, paid for and marked." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the pure white snow. "Now you step aside or we'll burn this whole place to the ground with you and your half-breed brats inside." Something inside Eliza snapped. The fear that had held her captive for so long suddenly burned away, replaced by a white-hot rage. She stepped forward, past the girls, to stand just behind Ada's shoulder. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might crack her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You bought me like cattle," she said, her words sharp as ice. "But I was never yours to own, and I sure as hell ain't going back." Sullivan's face twisted into a contemptuous sneer. "You think anyone's gonna protect you out here? You're just a whore who's found a new stable." In an instant, faster than Eliza could blink, Ada raised his bow. The arrow was aimed squarely at Sullivan's chest. The air grew thick, heavy, silent. "She is not property," Ada said, his voice as calm and cold as a frozen river. "She is not prey. She is fire. She is shelter. She is a name. You will leave this place now or you will fall here." The silence stretched, taut and vibrating. The horses shifted uneasily, their breath pluming in the cold air. One of the younger men muttered something to the other. "Ain't worth it, Jed." He began to slowly back his horse away. Sullivan hesitated, his eyes darting from Ada's unwavering aim to Eliza's defiant face, then to the 2 small girls who now stood flanking her like fierce, miniature guardians. He saw something in their collective gaze he hadn't expected. Not fear, not submission. He saw a wall, a fortress. "Fine," he hissed, his face contorted with fury. "Rot in the snow then, all of you." They mounted their horses and retreated, the sound of their hooves pounding a frantic rhythm as they disappeared back into the forest. Only when they were completely gone did Ada lower his bow. Eliza let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and sank to her knees in the snow, her legs suddenly refusing to support her. I didn't think they'd just walk away," she stammered. Ada looked down at her, his expression softening. "They saw something they didn't expect," he said, turning to look back at his daughters. "A family that wouldn't break." The twins rushed to her, wrapping their small arms around her neck, holding on tight. "We don't belong to the town," Na said fiercely, her cheek pressed against Eliza's. "We belong here." Eliza nodded slowly, the tears finally coming, hot against her cold skin. For the first time, she felt it too. This wasn't a safety she had borrowed. This was a safety she had built, a safety that was defended with bows and arrows and undeniable truth. As the smell of the bubbling stew wafted from the cabin and the smoke curled peacefully up through the chimney, she knew with absolute certainty that she would never again hide her face in the snow. Not with these girls, not with this man, not in this home. But as Ada helped her to her feet, his hand warm and strong on her arm, he leaned in close. "They will be back," he whispered, his voice grim, "and they will bring more men and fire. This was not an ending, Eliza. It was a beginning." The wind began its warning howl that night, long before the first flakes of the real storm began to fall. It was a different kind of wind than before. It wasn't just cold. It was angry. It crept through the tiny cracks in the logs and tugged at the corners of the hide roof, as if testing the strength of the small fortress they had built. Ada went out twice into the growing gale, his body a dark silhouette against the churning gray sky. He reinforced the door with extra timber and packed mud and snow into the chinks in the walls. Eliza helped him, her hands numb with cold, hanging thick hides, as heavy as rugs, over the single window. Inside, the warmth from the fire seemed to fight a losing battle against the encroaching cold. It cast long, flickering shadows that danced on the walls like troubled spirits. The smell of dried herbs hung in the air, a small, fragrant protest against the fury outside. The girls had fallen asleep early, exhausted by the day's events. They were curled together under a heavy buffalo blanket, their cheeks rosy from the fire's heat, their small faces peaceful in their innocence. Eliza stood at the edge of the hearth, watching Ada. He was moving with a quiet, intense focus, sharpening the obsidian blade with a practiced, rhythmic motion, stone against stone. It was a sound as old as the mountains themselves. "Do these storms, do they always come this fast?" she asked, her voice a whisper, almost swallowed by the shriek of the wind. Ada didn't look up from his work. "Not always," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But when they do, they stay longer than they should." His words sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. They echoed her own story, storms that lingered, cold that overstayed its welcome, pain that froze the soul. She walked towards him, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and sat on the floor beside him. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. Sullivan and his men. Ada finally set the blade down, placing it carefully on a piece of leather. "Not during this," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire. "They are cowards, not wolves. They will wait for the storm to pass." He glanced at her then, his gaze steady and serious. "But when it clears, yes, I do." Eliza nodded slowly, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. The silence between them wasn't heavy or awkward. It was layered, like snowflakes settling one on top of the other, each one adding its own small weight. "I don't understand how you can be so calm," she said, the words tumbling out of her. "They threatened to kill you. They threatened to burn your home. They threatened your children." Atta's eyes flicked to the firelight, which glowed against the dark stone of the hearth. "Because fear is loud," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It screams, and it threatens, and it makes a great deal of noise. But strength is quiet." He turned to face her fully now, and in the small enclosed space, she was suddenly aware of how close they were. Not just in physical space, but in the shared landscape of their pasts. "Do you remember the first thing your girls said to me?" Eliza asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "They handed me their mother's spoon and told me I could marry their papa." Atta let out a soft, low chuckle, a surprising sound in the midst of the storm. "That was their test," he said. "Spoon means you cook. Cooking means you stay." "And what if I can't cook?" she teased gently, trying to lighten the heavy mood. "They would still keep you," he said, his voice losing all its humor, becoming serious once more. "You came back for them today. You stood with us. You stayed for all of us." The fire crackled, sending a soft burst of orange light across their faces. Then Atta reached out, his movements slow and deliberate. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His touch was light, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. "You have walked through things that would have broken other people, Eliza," he said, his thumb stroking her temple. "And still, you are here." She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment, barely breathing. "I only made it because someone gave me shelter when I didn't deserve it." "No one has to deserve warmth," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that she felt more than heard. "Just like no one has to earn breath. You survive. That is enough." Outside, the snow began in earnest, not in flakes, but in a thick, driving sheet that blotted out the world. It fell without sound, a heavy, white blanket that was burying the cabin, the trees, the tracks of their enemies, the wounds of yesterday. Inside, Eliza reached for his hand, not out of desperation or fear, but because finally she could, because it felt like the only real and solid thing in a world that was trying to tear itself apart. No ring bound them. No ceremony had been spoken over them. But this, she thought, as her fingers intertwined with his, this was what a promise looked like. Not a vow spoken in front of witnesses in a church, but two people, in a small cabin, deciding to stay and face the storm together. In their sleep, one of the girls stirred, murmuring Eliza's name in a sleepy, trusting voice. Eliza turned to look at them, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love that was so powerful it almost hurt. "I'm here," she whispered back into the darkness. And this time, she meant it with every fiber of her being. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't waiting for permission to belong. She was already part of the fire, the silence, the steady hands that had saved her life. The storm would pass. All storms did. But what would remain after it was gone? A family, a fortress, a home. It would be hers to keep and hers to defend. As the storm raged, Atta looked at her, his face grim in the firelight. "Sullivan is not the only threat," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Your husband, Silas. He is the real poison. Sullivan wants the mine. But Silas wants you. And he knows this land. He has been here before." Eliza felt a cold dread seep into her bones. "What do you mean?" Atta picked up the obsidian blade again, turning it over in his hands. "The initials on my wife's spoon," he said, his voice flat and dead. "AK. Her name was Anka, and the man who led the raid that killed her. He worked for Sullivan. A young, ambitious man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. His name was Croft. Silas Croft." The world stopped. The wind, the fire, the beating of her own heart. Everything went silent. Her past and his were not just intertwined. They were the same story, told from different sides of a river of blood. She had not brought a new danger to this family. She had brought an old one home. By morning, the world outside was pure white, silent, and blindingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. It had buried the trail, the fence line, and nearly half the cabin's door in a deep, pristine drift. But inside, the silence was different. It was warmer, rooted like a sacred hush meant to protect rather than punish. Eliza woke first. Her head was resting on something firm but warm. She realized it was Ada's shoulder. She didn't know when she had moved closer to him in the night, only that she had. One of the twins was pressed against her ribs, a small, warm weight that felt impossibly right. She didn't move for a long while. She just stared at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling and listened to the slow, even breathing of the three people who had become her world. For the first time in months, maybe even years, she didn't feel hunted. She felt kept. Ada stepped back inside a few minutes later, having dug a narrow path out of the door. His arms were heavy with logs, and a thick dusting of snow covered his shoulders and hair. She sat up, disentangling herself from the sleeping child, and reached for one of the smaller logs to help him. He didn't hand it over, he just looked at her, and a small, tired smile touched his lips. "Let me do this part," he said. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on him, watching the way he moved. Slower today, more deliberate, as if he wasn't just surviving anymore either. He was carrying the weight of their shared past. Silas. The name hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. When the fire had returned to a full, roaring flame and the girls had stirred awake, yawning and stretching in the warmth, they gathered around the small, rough table. Eliza didn't have much to work with, only cornmeal and a handful of dried berries, but she mixed and shaped small cakes with careful, focused hands. As the cakes cooked on a hot stone near the fire, Tali disappeared into a corner of the cabin. She returned a moment later, clutching a tiny bundle wrapped in a scrap of old cloth. "For you," she said to Eliza, holding it out with both small hands, her expression solemn. Eliza crouched down to be at her level, her heart aching at the gravity in the child's face. "What is it, sweet girl?" The girl unwrapped it slowly, her fingers clumsy but careful. Inside lay the spoon. Not the one Ada had carved for Eliza. The other one. The one that had belonged to their mother. It was worn from years of use, the handle smoothed by time and love and tiny fingers. "It was our mama's," the other twin, Na, whispered from behind her sister. Eliza's throat tightened. She felt tears burning at the back of her eyes. Are you sure?" The girls nodded in perfect unison. "Now you cook here," Na said with the simple, irrefutable logic of a child. "So it's yours." Eliza couldn't speak. She simply knelt there on the dirt floor, her eyes burning, her fingers trembling as they closed around the spoon. It held more meaning, more weight, more love than any gold ring or legal document ever could. Ada had been standing behind her, silent. He had watched the entire exchange without a word. She finally found the strength to rise and turn to face him, the spoon clutched in her hand like a sacred relic. "They don't give that to just anyone," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "Only to the one they hope will stay." "Then I better stay," she said, her voice thick but steady. The girls beamed, their relief palpable. But Ada didn't smile. He simply stepped forward and took her face gently in both of his large, warm hands. "Not because you're grateful," he said, his voice intense. "Not because you're afraid. Stay because this is home. Stay because Silas Croft took my wife from me, and I will not let him take you too." She nodded slowly, the tears finally slipping free, hot against her cold cheeks. "It is home," she whispered. That evening, they cleared a patch of snow just outside the cabin door and dug a shallow hole in the frozen earth. Together, the four of them, they planted the spoon in the ground like a seed. They marked the spot with a small circle of stones. They were promising each other, and the spirit of the woman who had come before, that they would never leave it behind. "It's our start," Eliza said, brushing a dusting of snow from one of the stones. "Not our end." Atta came to stand beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. He pressed his forehead to hers. "The girls will remember this day forever," he said. "Not the storm, not the fear, this." They returned inside, hand in hand, into the warmth that welcomed them like a living thing. The next few days brought more snow, more quiet, more healing. Atta taught Eliza how to properly string and draw his powerful bow, her muscles aching with the new effort. The girls taught her the names of the winter constellations and made dolls for her out of corn husks and old socks. And every evening, they set the table with 4 wooden bowls. The space where the spoon had been was now empty. It was not for soup anymore. It was for belonging, a symbol, a root, a foundation. The past was buried. The present was being honored. And the future would grow from it. One night, as Eliza sat by the fire, Atta's arm resting lightly behind her on the bench, and the girls curled asleep at her knees, she whispered, "This is the family I didn't even know how to ask for." And none of them answered. Not with words, only with warmth, only with staying. But on the 5th day, as the sun was setting, Atta returned from a hunting trip, his face a grim, hard mask. He was carrying a freshly killed deer, but that's not what made Eliza's blood run cold. In his other hand, he held an arrow. It was not one of his. The fletching was made from gray goose feathers, and the shaft was marked with a single crude black ring. "He's here," Atta said, his voice flat and dangerous. "He's hunting. Not for game. He left this on the trail, pointed toward the cabin. It's a message." Eliza looked at the arrow. "What does it mean?" "It means he knows you are here," Atta said, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "And it means he is no longer afraid to show himself. He is coming, Eliza, and he is coming to finish what he started."